Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. In March 2020, the government ordered businesses closed in response to the COVID-19 pandemic that left millions of Californians unemployed and in critical need of unemployment compensation to pay for essential things such as food and housing. That led to an historically high number of claims with the state's Employment Development Department, EDD, the agency that administers the state's unemployment compensation system. Recently, the state auditor took a look at the state response to the claim surge and found it more than a little lacking. Our guest is Elaine Howle, California State Auditor. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Pleasure to be here. Good to see you.
So let's get right into it. You state in your report that, quote, significant weaknesses in EDD's claims processing and workload management leave it at risk of a continuing backlog of claims, unquote. Can you explain?
Sure. As you know, and I'm sure many of your viewers know, we've audited EDD in the past, and EDD has consistently struggled historically to process unemployment claims timely. Typically, they're expected to get benefits out within at least 14 days, or maybe a 21-day window. But what we saw when we audited them this last year is they hadn't heeded some of the suggestions that we made years ago, 10 years ago, to come up with a recession plan, to make sure that they had a plan in place to be able to deal with the next recession. Certainly the pandemic is unprecedented, but they have really struggled in processing claims, getting benefits out to unemployed Californians. They also are really struggling with their call center. People are having difficulty getting through the call center to even talk to a person to try to get help.
You know, you also report that, quote, because EDD responded to the claim surge by suspending certain eligibility requirements, many Californians are at risk of the need to repay the benefits, unquote. What actions did the EDD take that caused these problems?
Right. EDD did 2 key things. First, they suspended the eligibility determination. So typically when you file an unemployment claim, EDD will go through a process to determine whether you're eligible for unemployment. Have you earned enough wages in the past to be eligible for unemployment? They waived those requirements. So there are millions of claimants out there who didn't have to submit the materials, or they submitted the materials and EDD just didn't check their eligibility and went ahead and approved the benefits. Now, as the federal government became aware of this last fall, U.S. Department of Labor said, EDD, you can't do that. You can't just suspend eligibility. You have to determine whether people are eligible. Now EDD has to go back, and it's about 2.4 million claimants that we identified as where their eligibility determination had been suspended. So some of those individuals may be deemed ineligible for the benefits they received, and now EDD may ask them to pay the money back.
Oh boy. And apparently some of these people probably were trying to use the call center. And as you indicated, there were some problems with the call center.
Right. There were significant problems. They've historically had problems with the call center. In the past, when we've audited them, maybe 15, 20% of people are able to get through to a human being and talk to someone to get their questions answered. During the pandemic and during the huge surge of unemployment claims, huge surge of calls into the call center, it went down to less than 1%. And then even after the governor strike team went in, they added about 3,000 or 4,000 additional people to help with the call center. The performance was still really poor because you had tens of thousands of hundreds of thousands of calls coming in, and the call center, the folks just could not handle that volume.
Yeah, it sounds like, though, from your report that EDD's been here before. I mean, during the Great Recession of 2008, 2009, didn't they experience many of the same problems, yet nothing?
Right, and exactly. We issued a report in March of 2011, and we identified processing problems with their claims processing system, problems with their call center. And so what we suggested back in 2011 is, we just came out of a recession, or we're exiting a recession. Recessions typically occur every 5 or 6 years. You've got to have a recession plan in place. You've got to update some of your automation as far as being able to automate claims. They were handling a lot of claims manually, and it just takes too long to do that.
So what are some of your recommendations?
Some of our recommendations, similar to what we made in the past, but we have specific timelines on the recommendations this time. We're suggesting to EDD that you've got to figure out what elements of your process you can continue to automate. Now, one thing they did that has been very positive is they implemented ID Meet, which is an automated electronic way of verifying someone's identity. So that has really helped with their ability to process claims. But again, they still have that other workload that they suspended eligibility determinations months ago. So they're going to have to go back and figure out how they're going to handle all of the different workload that they have. They have these suspended eligibility claims. They have more people filing for unemployment. They have a backlog of claims. So there's a lot that EDD needs to do.
It's unfortunately, in addition to EDD's poor performance in making valid claims, not getting valid claims paid, apparently they've also had a staggering number of potentially fraudulent claims being paid. So we're going to have that conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. Since the surge in pandemic-related California unemployment claims, there have been many reported cases of potential and actual fraud. We're talking with California State Auditor Elaine Howle about a blockbuster report her office issued about the mismanagement of the state's unemployment compensation system that could cost the state billions of dollars. So in your report, you state that, quote, EDD's fraud prevention approach during the pandemic was marked by significant missteps and inaction, unquote. Can you explain?
Sure. There were a couple of key issues that we identified as far as inaction. I mean, obviously the pandemic hit us in February and March, and everything started closing down in March, and there was a huge surge in, unfortunately, people in California unemployed, so a huge surge in claims coming into EDD. Well, it wasn't until July did they put a control in place where it would kick out certain suspicious claims, someone whose identity they weren't able to determine. And again, we talked about eligibility determinations being suspended, but once they put that control back in place, there were a lot of claims now that were starting to get kicked out, but they had already paid out a bunch of benefits. The second issue that they did not do is suspicious addresses. As we've seen in the news, there have been numerous situations where 10, 20, 30 envelopes going to an address where no one at that address filed for unemployment. EDD didn't put any control in place related to that until September. But when we conducted audit work, we found in December they were still paying out claims to some of these suspicious addresses. So they failed to put the proper controls in place. And unfortunately, that equates to fraudulent payments going out.
Yeah, you also note in your report that, quote, EDD's lack of preparation left it unable to effectively address two high-profile situations, unquote. What preparation should have occurred? And can you tell us a little about those two high-profile situations?
Sure. One of the high-profile situations is the frozen accounts. As I'm sure your viewers are aware, that Bank of America puts out benefit cards for unemployment claimants. That's how they get their benefits. They receive a card. Well, there were some suspicious claims that Bank of America brought to EDD's attention. EDD told them to freeze the accounts. EDD did not have a plan to determine, of the 344,000 accounts that it told B of A to freeze, how many of those potentially, what would the plan be to review those claims to determine, are there legitimate claimants in there, and let's unfreeze those accounts. So they didn't have a plan in place to address how they were going to work with the B of A, and some, unfortunately, legitimate claimants got caught up in that. The second issue is cross-matching against incarceration data. Similarly to what the DAs have talked about is once EDD put a cross-matching in place where they're matching a claim against an individual who's incarcerated either at a local jail or either in another state or at a state correctional institution, they found $810 million of payments for benefits associated with someone who is incarcerated. So that was another significant problem that we had in California.
That just seems to add insult to injury, right? You got people that are incarcerated that are actually doing the fraud while in jail. It's just, Yeah, pretty amazing. Anyway, your report also states that, quote, EDD has relied on uninformed and disjointed techniques to prevent imposter fraud. What do you mean by that?
Right. And some of the situations where the cross-matching occurred and the suspicious addresses where there are multiple envelopes going to an address, well, some of those individuals, unfortunately, probably had their identity stolen. We identified about 70,000 complaints coming into EDD in the last 9 months of 2020. Typically, in an entire calendar year, EDD gets about 6,000 complaints of identity theft. Where we're saying there's a fragmented process, EDD has a variety of different units within the department that some identify potential fraud, but they have to notify another unit to stop payment on that claim. There is not a unified, coordinated approach within the department to make sure that if one unit is identifying suspicious claims, another unit is well aware that we need to suspend those payments, stop paying on those particular benefits. It's very, very convoluted and disjointed, and they need to have a structured approach to fraud prevention and detection.
So what are some of your recommendations to kind of overcome, address some of these shortcomings?
Well, first recommendation related to cross-matching. I mean, they do have a contract in place now, but what we recommended to the legislature is to require EDD to have a standard process for cross-matching, regardless of, someday, hopefully, we're going to get out of this pandemic. But of course, we're going to run into recessions in the future, and there will be surges of claims. EDD should consistently, regardless of the environment, be cross-matching against incarceration data. They should be reporting that information to the legislature and to the public. In addition, any benefits that they're working with EDD, they've got to come up with a comprehensive list. How many accounts have been frozen? How many remain frozen? How are we going to approach unfreezing those accounts and getting those benefits out to the legitimate claimants? And then the last key recommendation, we have a variety of recommendations, is they need to strengthen their fraud prevention and detection efforts. And that starts with having one group within EDD that's responsible for all of the coordination among the various units. So just a snapshot of a few of the recommendations. We have several in the 2 reports we issued.
Right. Well, I want to thank the State Auditor Elaine Howle for joining us. Up next, did Trump's White House fail to prepare California for the massive unemployment fraud that it's experiencing? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. Because federal money helps pay for the state's unemployment compensation program, Washington can have a strong role in how the system works. State officials are saying that the Trump administration is partly to blame for the widespread fraud that has shaken the state's unemployment compensation system. Who's really to blame? Our guest is David Lightman, a national political correspondent for McClatchy Newspapers. He's joining us from Washington, D.C., and he's done a fact check on the issue and he's here to tell us the answer. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
So California Labor Secretary Julie Su has maintained that the Trump administration, quote, did not provide adequate guidance or information to protect against fraudulent rings state by state, unquote. On the other hand, California State Auditor Elaine Howle, who we just spoke with, has said that the federal Labor Department, quote, advised states about how to determine whether an individual was able and available for work in light of the pandemic, unquote. So who's to blame?
The issue involves the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance money. That's the federal program that covers self-employed people, gig workers, and so forth. That began on was approved on March 27th. Roughly 6 weeks later, the federal government sent out a detailed memo advisory to state agencies such as the California Employment Development Department, which manages the unemployment insurance program. It warned about potential fraud. It warned about potential problems. Did it specify that there could be organized criminal rings operating internationally? No, but it did warn. So the auditor here is correct. Months later, it continued to issue advisories. Now, did it warn about the scope of the fraud? No. Should it have? I'll leave that to the political debate. So in that sense, Sue was correct in that nobody warned them of the scope of this. But to say that somehow the Trump administration dropped the ball, that's a tougher one.
Yeah, I'm just wondering though, given the scale of what's going on here, how did the billions of dollars we're talking about, how did the the states not see this program was going to be a prime target for fraud?
Yeah, especially when, again, the auditor said they weren't really checking eligibility that carefully. They wanted to get the money out the door because, after all, we were in the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression. But again, nobody saw the scope of this. Nobody saw the tens of billions of dollars. It wasn't until really early summer, I believe, that federal officials, state officials started to notice, hey, something's really gone awry here.
You know, it's interesting too. I think one of the things that I saw in your fact check was you noted that technology was a problem here. That a lot of these state systems, California, maybe a prime example, they're a little behind the curve when it comes to technology, using technology to make sure you have an efficient and effective unemployment compensation system.
Yeah, that's a good point. And in fact, we went back, my colleague Wes Ventitcher and I went back years and years. You can look at audits, and they're all online back to 2011, 2009, that said you got to beef up this technology system. You're not ready for the next recession. And somehow they kept sort of, I don't want to say fumbling, but it never quite got up to where it was. The other issue involves cross-checking claims against Social Security numbers. California was one of 15 states that didn't do that, and that hurt as well. So it never quite gelled, according to the auditor.
So, okay, now they're aware of the problem, and I'm just wondering, have USDOL, U.S. Department of Labor, and the California EDD fixed the problem? So have they eliminated the fraud and made sure that legitimate claims are being paid?
We don't know if they've eliminated the fraud, but certainly they've taken strong steps to do so. The new director, Rita Sines, is following the auditor's recommendations. The auditor still had some comments about the pace of this, but it appears they're on track. They've been briefing us, they being EDD, every 2 weeks, kept us up to date. We'll just have to see.
Yeah, well, hopefully, given the scope of the problem, hopefully they have. I want to thank our guest, David Lightman from McClatchy Newspapers, for joining us. Up next, we're going to talk about the political fallout. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. So what's the political fallout at the state capitol with the EDD scandal? Let's ask two of the most knowledgeable observers of state politics that we know, John Myers, the Sacramento bureau chief for the LA Times, and Dan Walters, the well-read columnist for CalMatters. Welcome back to the Maddy Report, guys.
Thank you.
So Dan, let me ask you, the problems that have been coming up with the EDD, late claims, massive fraud, is obviously going to have some impact on Governor Newsom. Just wondering, is it going to have a big impact in this possible recall or in the 2022 reelection, or is really how he handles the COVID pandemic generally and school reopening specifically going to be more important?
Well, I think EDDs take place along with several other pandemic-related issues, the general management of the thing in terms of opening and closing businesses and that sort of thing. The vaccine. Opening schools. Nobody knows when they're going to reopen, and the parents that they're anxious to have their kids go back to school, some of them are quite angry, and it could play into the recall movement as well. So it's a combination of things all related to the pandemic, of which EDD certainly is one, since it directly affects millions of Californians and indirectly even tens of millions perhaps.
Yeah, I want to ask John, Dan wrote an article recently, a column where we referred to it as a bureaucratic Chernobyl. I thought that was kind of an interesting phraseology. So John, let me ask you, what do you see in terms of this EDD problem? Is it going to be a big problem for him? Is it really kind of a minor problem? It's really going to be how he handles the pandemic. It's really going to affect either the recall or the 2022 election.
It's all of the above, Mark. I mean, it's a big soup, I would call it, of things that the governor has to deal with. I mean, EDD is kind of an interesting story. We could spend a long time talking about that because there's a systematic problem at EDD. It's a computer system that is archaic. It's the bureaucracy elements that Dan had talked about, and it's not the only state agency like that. And the things that the Newsom administration did to try to speed those checks up, like saying we don't have to do all the background information on these people, came back and bit them in the backside, of course, because we had the fraud issues there. But I think getting out of that is going to be a challenge. And also the investigation about the fraud is going to be the gift that keeps on giving to Newsom's opponents. And then, yes, vaccination rollout, how he manages that, what happens on schools, all of this combined is a big toxic soup, I think, for Team Gavin Newsom. And it's going to be an interesting few weeks to see how they handle this. And then, of course, into the spring and summer remains to be seen.
Well, John, this is going to be, they're talking about this $11 billion scandal, with these fraudulent claims. Do you get the sense, though, that this is going to have legs, or is this going to be just another example of, mismanagement, and it's going to be forgotten by the collective, public?
I don't think it's forgotten. And I think for part of the reason that I said just a moment ago, too, kind of to incline point on it, Mark, the investigation of the fraud, the frustration with the fraud, the demands from some Republicans in Washington and around the state that California is going to have to repay that money somehow, because, of course, there's this combination of funds from the federal government sometimes when you need them in the unemployment insurance fund. This is a drip, drip, drip. We see this in politics all the time. This is going to be a tough one. And I think, the governor has got to he's got new leadership at the EDD. He's going to have to pick a new leader of the State Labor and Workforce Agency because Julie Su, his secretary, has now been appointed to a job in the Biden administration. This is going to keep playing out, and it's going to be playing out at the same time as all those other issues. So I think it has legs in the sense that people are going to find out more about what has really been going on at EDD. And the longer that goes, I think the tougher it's going to be for the governor.
So, Dan, we've got about 30 seconds left in the segment. Drip, drip, drip.
Yeah, I'm going to keep on going. Even under the best of circumstances, millions of Californians are going to be dependent on these EDD payments. And as they become more and more frustrated with the backlog of claims and everything, this thing is going to roll on for months, easily months. This is a very big thing, and it's very, very important to the people who are supposed to be getting these payments and their families.
So stay tuned. I guess we're going to hear on this topic. I want to thank our guests, California State Auditor Elaine Howle, David Lightman with McClatchy Newspapers, Dan Walters with CalMatters, and John Myers with the LA Times. And thank you for joining us. This is Mark Keppler for the Maddy Report. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org. If you want to stay up to date on state and local politics, you can sign up for our free e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org.